Let's start now the last part of this two very intensive day of listening to witnesses and experts. We have the final report, which would be an overview of different issues which have been touched, and those things will be put in a possible framework. And after that, we shall have some last questioning from the jury, and then we proceed to the closure of this session.
I will begin from the last presentations, because that's been the most, I would say, the first major response.
Excuse me, knowing that everybody knows you, but could you present yourself so that that will be also on record? Thanks.
Okay. I'm Ashim Roy. I'm the part of the Asia Flowage Steering Committee and part of the team of the legal experts who are trying to defend and submit the propositions for the living wage here, and as a practicing trade unionist from India. So I'll try to really take on to what my the earlier two presentations that has been made by the colleagues here, and look at the last part of the question, and look at the experts that has come in today and link it up with some of the issues that has been said yesterday, and try to argue as to why the global supply chain requires to really give in and give support and give in to the idea of a living wage. But let me begin by saying that there are three major brands that has actually, two which has come and made a presentation here, and one which has given a statement here: Puma, Adidas, and H&M. I think everyone has heard here, they have testified here as to what their intentions and what they're planning to do. But throughout their three presentation, I want to come, because that's a structural weakness that I want to point out. The structural weakness is that they have all come to one single point, that we will make the suppliers comply. We will make the suppliers comply. If suppliers do not comply, we'll eliminate the suppliers. But the question that is not being raised, the assumption behind this thing is that suppliers are at fault, and if suppliers do not comply to it, then they should be rejected out of whatever system that they have produced in the last few years. So there's a structural question of rejection and acceptance of suppliers as the foundation of their methodology. I want to come to that point again, but I want to make it a point that to assert it here, that I would address that it assumes that the suppliers are the main faulters and the main guilty people in this whole process, which they are partly to a large extent. But much more fundamental and much more important is the brands and the buyers themselves, who should be taking responsibility for what is happening in the global supply chain or global production system in the garment. And I'm going to argue why that is necessary and why that is legitimate, and why it is important from the point of view of law. And I would again get back to, this is my first point, framing up. The second framing up, I'm going to really get back, and I would require the indulgence of the jury here, that, you know, to be very serious about it, we need to discuss the relationship of a market framework to the law framework. And I would really address what is the new kind of market which is not being regulated and so requires to be regulated. I'll really address that question in a minute. So let me, so we have come to a conclusion, and I think the conclusion is very clear. It's been very clear in Cambodia, it's been very clear in Sri Lanka. In any of the Asian countries that we have investigated, by way of a trade union report, by way of a collective understanding, of shared understanding, or by way of a tribunal, there's a second tribunal in the process of the Asia Flow Wage. And Sri Lanka came to the same conclusion, Cambodia has come to the same conclusion, that there is a wage deficit in the garment industry and garment workers. And this is very interesting, that all the brands and everyone comes to a conclusion that we will comply with the legal requirement of wage. So my first contention and my first submission here would be that the minimum wage that is existing in most of these countries are inadequate for a living wage. And I'll come to this derogation of the minimum wage concept from what was enshrined in the Philadelphia Declaration, which was minimum living wage. And I want to draw the attention that the Philadelphia Declaration, when it enacted the idea of a minimum living wage, it had the concept of a living wage. But as it became implemented and as it got converted into a convention, the reality of the developing countries and underdeveloped countries came into existence, and slowly the minimum wage got translated into what would we call a physical minimum wage, which would be meaning, and as the world started to deal with the poverty question, and there was a consensus in the world with both FAO declaring what is the caloric norm for a worldwide poverty line, and the World Bank coming to an idea that there has to be an elimination of extreme forms of poverty in the world. The minimum wage got translated into what is called a poverty level wage. The wage at which you have to see that the people do not exist. So, and this is much more important from the fact, and I would really submit to the report which has been produced here of Cambodia, which I would submit to all of you. This is a report of the Cambodian Economic Association, which tells you exactly what is the poverty level of the rural Cambodia, which talks about what is the wage level and the income level at the rural area, and how the garment workers are the first source, the two industry that becomes the first source for people graduating out of the rural setting, which is in construction, and in Cambodia that's also another one, is the garment. So in a certain sense, the poverty level wages become the major factor of determining the living wage. And this is unfortunately so a common experience and legally accepted as a norm in most of the Asian countries. I want to say that we should have to go beyond this legal norm at this point of time. This is a legal norm. Everywhere where the minimum wage has been codified, analyzed, made into a criteria for investigation or for determination, they're all based on the idea that the notion of a minimum wage is to eliminate the poverty level. Precisely why? Because in those countries, it was in very underdeveloped countries, large rural population which had to make the first level of transition to the urban world, to the industrial world, and so the minimum wage was based on a poverty level. So I do not fault, I mean, one can argue against it, but I will still not fault them for that, for what they have done. But that is an inadequate wage for living. That is the point which has come so clearly everywhere. Now, if that is not the wage, the poverty level does not become the right thing, how would and this is again that has come out from these reports and the various submission that has been made here, that the per capita income of these countries is so low, particularly in Cambodia, that you are using export industry as a method to elevate yourself from the poverty in this country. Now, in such a situation, the export industry, particularly an export industry that is trying to see that the development of the country takes place, cannot be based on a poverty level wage. Because if it does, then it does not change the structure of that country's economy or help in national development. And the question would be that does the global production system has the capacity for paying higher than the minimum wage on a poverty level wage? That's the question that we want to pose. And it's very important that we discuss this out and frame this out, because if that is so, that we would, otherwise the whole idea of an export-led industrialization would not help a country, and particularly a country like Cambodia, which has come from a very recently from a very impoverished level and has made the first experimentation democracy to move forward into a new democratic world. So that's the point so what have we done? We have decided that there cannot be minimum wage cannot be the criteria. So what would be the criteria for a living wage? And that's where we get into a minefield. Because everyone understands the notion of a living wage. Everyone likes the idea of a living wage. Everyone has talked endlessly for the last 20 years on living wage, but very few people has been able to define it in concrete terms in a global setting. What has happened is that living wage is very easily definable in a national context. I would submit that enough has been decided, enough work has been done to define a living wage in a national context. The question would come up, why are we trying to define a living wage outside a national context? And that is why the notion of a minimum living wage comes into. Why are we trying to define a living wage outside national context? This is the first time that one has tried to evolve, an AFW has tried to evolve a regional notion. So one has to justify or rationally give you the reasons as to why we are trying to do on a regional level. And I'll come to that question. And that's the question related to the globalization, I would say. And I would say a fair globalization cannot happen unless we come to a regional notion of a living wage. But I'll argue, before I argue that out, I want to say, what is the globalization done in relationship to the wage setting question? Fundamentally what it has done, it has done very starkly, very clearly, very aggressively, and very, very, very sharply, is in garment industry. That what is a normal conception of economics, and anyone who's a student of economics would know that the product market, or the production and the consumption, always happens on a same economy. So product market, or what would be in a managerial language could be called a product market, and the labor market are existing in one economy. What is fundamentally wrong with the whole garment industry, and so a new legislation is required, is that the whole garment industry has broken this concept. You have a product market which is totally different, and you have a labor market which is totally different. How do you relate the labor market and a product market? This is very, very important, and I would submit the law has to deal with this new situation. We all learned the notion of minimum living wage or living wage in national setting because that dealt with the idea that we have one product market and one labor market integrated into a national economy. This separation or disarticulation is so prominent in the globalization that the old forms of law or legislations are becoming inadequate to deal with this new reality. What does it mean when you say that the product market and labor market has thing? And this is what my point is. The whole assumption here that we have done is, and I would submit again, that as if it's a fight between just a labor and the suppliers. And this is what is so important, that it is not a market situation. I will come to that point. That is very important. That the whole mechanism between the buyers and the suppliers, it is not a market, or what is called in law an arm's length principles. I would submit the arm's length principle do not operate in a relationship to a supplier and buyer, because it's a contractual agreement. It's an agreement that is decided in a long-term contract, and decided on, and I would come that whenever you're looking at a long-term contract, you'll have to come back to the power relationship of a contract. But the market is not the determining principles of this transaction, and that is very, very important. So slowly what has happened, that you have the emergence of globalization has also allowed for the emergence of a new market, what I would call the market, and which has not been mine, it has been many economists who have talked about it. I'm just using their phrase, rephrasing them into our context, is that they have said that either the production segments become marketable or the task becomes marketable. So we have today what I would say a contract market for manufacturing. You have come to an emergence of a new market, which is what would be called a subcontracting, or contracts are emerging as a market determining. The contracts are coming to the market, and it is their market which is being actually accessed by the suppliers. And let us look at this market. What is the contract manufacturing market? The contract manufacturing market has two very specific characteristics which needs to be addressed for any idea of a regulation of this. And that is that it has a very intrinsic way of what is the market. This market basically means, and I would come back to a slide that the AFW Ananya showed, of what is called, this market determines the FOB cost, the freight on board cost of any product. It does not decide the retail market cost. This market determines what is we call the garment's FOB cost. And I would say that this FOB cost is determined by the threat of relocation by the buyers. The power of this market, this market is brought to the minimum level by the power that the brands have of threat of relocation. That if you don't give in, I will move my supplier to another country. So we have emergence of two things that has come in, I would submit. One is the contract manufacturing market. So not an arm's length principle, but a contract, a long-term contract, and in the long-term contract, the threat of relocation, which is experienced by us, the workers, as an inability to raise the wages beyond the minimum wage in our own countries. I mean, Cambodian workers and the unions have done a heroic battle. Very few garment workers on the world have come to such a large scale of a battle in the last 1 year. And yet they have not been able to move the wage level beyond $5. There's a rigidity in this whole system that requires to be addressed, and it cannot be left to the burden of either for the whole human rights community in the world, and as well for the union movement, that it be left to the responsibility of only the Cambodian workers. So, how do we address? We have to address and this is what my point is, threat of relocation is not global. The constitution of this market has to be, in my submission, I would say that this market is constituted not globally. This market is constituted regionally. There's a geography of this market which is defined by what is a span of retaliation. How much can the buyer move the supplier? And our experience shows, and enough data has been produced here and can be shown again to show that those contract manufacturers or the manufacturers that are producing for the multinational or for the garments, they cannot move beyond the regional level. And so the threat of relocation becomes operated in a regional level, and so a regional contract market is constituted, and so the possibility and the necessity of deciding a regional living wage is a must. Otherwise, you will come to the idea that the threat of relocation can transfer the responsibility to someone else. Today, we have no legal mechanism in the world which can address this problem, this market. That is, suddenly in a globalization, we have emerged a market which is not regulated by anyone. And what I submit is that, and this is the point which I want to come back, all efforts in the last 15 years have only come to what would be called a moral notion. A notion that we should promote, we should respect, but no regulation. Even the Ruggles framework, which is I would say the best framework that has come out after all this experience, does not go beyond the idea of, if I submit, respect, promote, and remediation. So the assumption is that the same people who are benefiting from the very contract manufacturing market, who use the threat of relocation to determine the FOB price at the lowest level, are the one on their own goodwill come to an understanding that the world is bad and they need to change. To me, the 20 years of our experience of Clean Clothes Campaign and various other experiences shows that our rate of what you just asked, what is the rate of our achievement in this? The rate of change of the companies has been so low and so abysmal that we can take it for granted that they will not change on their own. They cannot change on their own. So we need to have something which is beyond their good wishes and goodwill. And their internal management system. The world cannot wait. The garment workers in Cambodia, the garment workers in Asia cannot wait for the managerial system to come into a play that they can change their system to a fairness. It is too long we have waited and we can't wait any longer. So I would say the Ruggles framework, which is a framework of, as I said, remediation, is very good morally. But we cannot, the workers cannot depend on that. And so we need to, which means that we need to intersect. Our efforts have to intersect in changing and shaping the market of the contract manufacturers. How do we regulate this? And I would come to a classical notion of how any regulation takes place. Either it takes place by the state or it takes place by the people. So classical question. If the state, we would try very hard for the state to regulate this market. Efforts have been made, efforts have failed. But there's one historical example and historical thing that we all have learned. There's not a single market in the world that in the end cannot be regulated. And all regulations begins with the people making an effort to regulate it. And I would submit the Asia Flow Wage is one such method of a union movement, of a civil society movement to regulate from the bottom the very market, what is called a contract manufacturing market. We cannot rely on the suppliers because they are so into the competitive framework that they cannot overcome the threat of relocation. The state are not willing to do that. The state are not willing to take on, I would say, the suppliers at all, and so I'm not willing to take on the buyers at all. But workers and civil society institutions have to take on this challenge, and the only way of taking this challenge is to conceptualize and put a figure to the regional, to a living wage that is regional, because otherwise again we will come back to the idea that only particular countries will be able to handle this issue. And so I submit that the Asia flow wage is a method to really, a people's method, what would be in legal terms called and I would say Professor Boehringer's point of view and his whole experience about the civil, what is called the civil common law tradition. That we are, the emergence of a common law framework means the emergence of a common law community which starts taking on the responsibility of regulating this market. And I would submit that we are in the verge of doing that. We are doing that by creating such a process. Which means that we really need to frame this up in a fashion that there is a process of intervention in this market which will start regulating this market. And that is what the whole idea of a regional living wage and Asia flow wage shapes, doesn't just talk about it. It's not a concept. It says this is the money. We are going to negotiate around this money. We are going to achieve this money. This is the money that we're talking about. And we're talking about a money that all of us understand in our own currency. It's talking about a money that makes tangible way of saying either you give this, you give me 80% of this, you give me 70% of this, but give me something that makes me nearer to that point of that money. So it's a very tangible, concrete definition of a living wage that the people in a region which are controlled and regulated by the contract manufacturing market, the contracts market, people who are affected by it are actually going to come to can affect it. I will come to another fundamental notion, sir, for your submission here, is that this market does not allow what would be classically called in economics, it does not allow the brands have, I would say brands do not make profit, brands make rent. Brands do not make profit, brands make rent. It is the suppliers who make very hard by working harder and harder to make some profit. The brands, because of the monopoly power of the markets, are only trying to exercise their right to shift from one supplier to another supplier. And hundreds of systems to ensure the suppliers comply to it, but not a single system to say it should be complying to us. No buyer has ever come and says, I understand that I'm cause of this, but I will give you suo moto 10%. The example of the Autogracia that was given here, it's a very good example. And even the two brands that has come in, let's not forget these are the brands which are being affected by what is called, and what an economist has called, the labor rights market, where labor rights starts impacting on the company. And these are the companies, few of them, but large chunk of the garment industry still do not want to address this issue. And so we need to bring this idea, the suppliers are making profit, and I would submit suppliers are making profit, the brands are making super profit and rent, which is very easily, has been shown by our expert testimonies yesterday. And this means that the possibility of that shift of money is possible. That rent can be made into a wage for us if we know how to regulate this market. And I would say Asia flow wage is one method of that regulation of this thing. Again an example, let us look at how much, if we are not going to make this effort, this will not work out. I was very intrigued by the idea that Cambodia began with a democratic upsurge. A new democratic institution was built up. And in the last 10 years, it has receded from the point of view what it was. And all these reports that are here, I would submit the report of the Yale University. The Yale University shows, it's a study of the short-term contract. It's very interesting. First, you didn't have a short-term contract. Then you had a short-term contract coming under the law. And now, what the Puma person said the 2 years, but the new law amendment says that by introducing a single word, which is called each, they have changed the very definition of contract. Earlier it was that you cannot have a short-term contract for more than 2 years. Now they have used a simple word called each. You will not be able to keep it more than each renewal of 2 years. So by intrusion of one simple word, the whole contractual mechanism has been made into a perpetuity in Cambodia. Now this is very interesting. It means that we have shifted from a very, let's say, much better law to a worse kind of law. So the whole question of, the fact that there was an idea that we are a tribunal, and the people in Cambodia are very averse to the idea of tribunal, is because the existing tribunal that is looking into some of the war crimes have been so criticized for being not according to the rule of law. So the general perception has come in that all tribunals are bad. Tribunals are something to make other people victimized. And this is again not my viewpoint. This is the viewpoint of actually one of the best human rights organizations in Cambodia. I'm going to submit this for your consideration. This all shows extensively how the rule of law is deteriorating in this country. In such a context, I would say it would be really not proper and responsible for all of us to give all the burden of this change in Cambodia only to the people of Cambodia. It's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the Asia Floor Alliance. It's responsibility of everyone who's interested in human rights and things. So I would suggest the last point, and this is the most important point before I come to the recommendations, which I would urge the panel to give. The last point is that this is a part of a process. No regulation can take place unless institutions come into existence. We are not state, so we cannot create the state institution. But we are people. We have organizations which are trying to create grassroots institutions which can enforce this thing. So the most important part, and I would really this panel to really tribunal to really give with forceful. That is imperative for making a fair labor system, imperative for a living wage to come in, that we actually contribute, every one of us. It's a recommendation to the people, a recommendation to the NGOs, recommendation to anyone who's interested, that we need a living wage network. We need an institution of a living wage network that should come. The tribunal is one part of it. It could be round tables, it could be union movement, it could be, but we need to institutionalize this into a system by which the people, and I would say again the historical experience of the common law tradition, that we create the institution on our own, and we have come to a point when globalization has forced us to create such an institution, and I would urge this tribunal to really give its thought, recommendation, and its force to such a concept, and see that this tribunal becomes the recommendation of this tribunal becomes a point of departure for building such a network. So, as I said, I will not take more time on this, but having made this few of those key points, I would say that what is important is that we know the minimum wage in no Asian countries, even China, which has actually gone away from this notion and has come to a social notion of wages. It is called the 60% of the median wages is what the minimum wage is. No criteria, only 60% of average wage. But even that country has decided after a long time that we are not nowhere near to the 60%, precisely because the global production system does not allow many of these suppliers in this country to move to the track or the trajectory of a living wage which is higher than the minimum wage. So it has to be something beyond a nation, and I have submitted that because of the very nature of the production change that has taken place, that there is a market for contract manufacturing which is determined by the right or the fear of relocation that exists with the buyers, with the big multinationals and the buyers in this garment industry. And so we need to really change and intervene into this regional market, and to us the Asia flow wage is a regional concept to intervene in that market, because we are affected by the high rent that the buyers get from each of the products that they sell, and we need to see that a part of that is negotiated. So it means there has to be, I would submit a clear recommendation not suppliers. The buyers have to dialogue and have a collective bargaining framework with the workers and unions of this regional market. That is, they will not just give the burden and responsibility to the suppliers to handle it. Suppliers can be an instrument of implementation of it, but suppliers cannot be the locus or the principal factor of giving this living wage. The buyers have to negotiate with the union. The buyers have to negotiate with the Asian garment workers, and having bargained with them, the notion of a principal employer, a principal and an agent, we are the victims of the principal. So we have a right to negotiate with the principal, and the agent can become the intermediary to enforce that and instrumentalize that the way it wants to do. We can even work out the mechanism of doing it, but the negotiation framework has to be from the principal to the one who is affected by it. And workers in Asia are affected by it. We are victims of it, and we have a right to see that we are called upon. We have a dialogue with the buyers, and we are allowed, and we would say that this tribunal to give a strong recommendation that their test of sincerity to the fair wage concepts, the sincerity to the living wage concept basically can only begin, even if they don't give, that is fine, but their sincerity will only begin when they really, genuinely, in a good faith, not talk about the suppliers will be forced, but they have a dialogue with the workers and workers' union in the region and directly have a regional concept of a discussion. If they don't call a regional meeting, if they don't have a dialogue with the regional workers, that means they are not committed to the idea of having something to do with the regional market, which means that they are not wanting, they don't mind having regulation of a supplier on national level, but they don't want to change the regional market. And I didn't want to burden, but if you go to the concept of freight, FOB, which is called the freight on board, the concept is in a particular, it doesn't matter from which country the which the product is being produced. But in a region, the FOB cost should be something similar. And if you look in the costing of the companies, we have shown this in our documentation of the AFW. We'll submit all of them to you, that the FOB cost is almost average or almost nearby for a whole region. And that is why the regional concept comes in. And I would submit the regional living wage is a very, very important concept. It's a well-defined concept. And now we are looking for a mechanism to see that how it can be implemented. That's the first recommendation that I would request. The second recommendation that I would urge the tribunal to take is that state has to have a regulatory power. It's our job what we are doing by the AFW, but how will state regulate the contract manufacturers? If it does not have state is regulating it now. State is regulating on the environment question. But state can regulate on so many. Today we are on the verge of saying climatic change should be brought into a regulatory framework on a regional level. So if climatic change issues of environment can be brought within the framework of a regional agreement or regional regulation, why can't the labor and social rights be brought into the framework of a regional regulation? So states are responsible, and I would submit the representative of ILO here. The ILO has to change its concept. I would say this tribunal recommends that the ILO and other international institutions promote the idea of a regional bargaining. Promote the idea that you have a situation where you cannot contend with the globalization until this regional characteristic of the markets come into play, and the institution, whether it's a WHO, FAO, or ILO, they all should contribute to the process of a regional regulatory mechanism within which the workers and the unions can participate, can effectively discharge. And the last, which I have already submitted, that it should be important that we all who are part of the civil society, part of the people, or part of the union movement, that we come together and try to create a living wage network that has power enough on its own and supported by the state to be able to regulate this new market. And with that, I think, which is the feasibility, as I said, we have defined Asia flow wage, we have defined the necessity of of doing it. We have defined the objective reality that requires such a regulation, and we have also suggested that the regulation can be a very effective method of trying to control this thing. With this, I would wait for any other questions. I would end here. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, which has made a very stimulating overview of the main issues which are at stake after the testimonies and the experts. I think now the presentation is open to questions by the panel.
You seem to have drawn on a great deal of literature there. You're going to submit all of that?
Yeah, I will submit all of them for you.
Thank you.
How many of you? I can burden you with more.
You were mentioning more directly the ILO. I would like that you could expand on the, say, position of ILO based on your experience and on most recent regulation, on the fact that this concept, as you were saying, which is somehow obvious, is not included or considered formally in ILO language, which I think is something which indicates possibly one core of resistance which should be faced in order to give an idea of promotion. I make an example taken from my experience. When in a similar situation, the WHO years back defined the accessibility to drugs, giving the name of essential drugs, the framework changed completely because drugs were transformed to be market goods, to tools to assure life, because accessibility was just to assure life for the majority of the population. And at that time, the big debates about drugs are goods or human rights started and is central now. I wonder whether you could see some advantage, some possibility of introducing also this approach for ILO. And when you were mentioning before the relationship with FAO and linking the minimum wage or what you are saying, the minimum calorie, which are again very insufficient terms to assure a decent life, because you could, as WHO say, you could die by malnutrition, but you not call that hunger. And then malnutrition is becoming a medical problem, so it's not taken up serious in that sense. So you are in fact proposing some change of paradigm in this sense. Could you expand a bit in order to have some very also practical indication in the role of ILO, in the international bargaining, and in the role they could have globally, because they recognize that this is the one global market, and that should be recognized as a market, the garments, which is not marginal but central with respect to the promotion or human rights, not only for these workers but for in general the working poor.
Can I take the first? I do agree, and I think it's a good comparison to which we could use for supporting this argument. In fact, I would add to that let's take an example of what I'm saying to the international patent regime that was broken by not very powerful people. It was broken by the HIV people. The very minority, but a very powerful community which exists in the globally, which fought endlessly in a persistent fashion for 10 years and broke the IPR regime to make an international law that you cannot bring those drugs under the patent regime. That's a fantastic victory from a people's point of view. So I'm saying that that is a possibility that exists in today's world. And as we have changed, the governments and even international trade laws have to accept that there are conditions where a typical market mechanism would not accept. And I would say that's an argument that we can draw in to say that it should be, the ILO should do something. And I would come back to, again, the ILO has never, and this is very interesting, the FAO and the World Bank, when we are faced with the idea of trying to address poverty, for the first 30 years till I think 1970s, there was no definition of what is a poverty. You know, but when there was a consensus that you have to really address the question of poverty, even the so-called national variations could be brought together, and slowly you started emerging what is called a global definition of poverty. Now one can have quibblings about how much is the global variation, but the fact is the FAO came in the end. And the South Asian, I quoted last time, the South South Asia community of Pacific and the Asia, they came with two very clear criteria to decide this would be the caloric content beyond which the poverty line would fall down. Now it's very strange that the ILO has not come yet to one definition of what is a basic need in terms of caloric content. I would urge that ILO should have done this. And I would urge that you should in fact suggest that ILO should come to what would be the lowest level of definition of a working person. You know, we have various, I mean, what Ananya said about 3,000 calories is it's not our question. 3,000 has come out of a long program which ILO did with government of Indonesia. And this is a conceptualization which is defined very precisely with 42 basket of commodities, that this would be the requirement for a 300 calories. That is, they have defined a living wage is one that can give a person 300 calories. 3,000 calories, sorry, pardon me. 3,000 calories. So it's a government, an ILO-induced government program that came to first conceptualization in the whole of Asia of what would be. India was the first, but it did not give a living wage. It gave a need-based minimum wage. So need-based minimum wage was defined in 1956 as 2,700 calories. Indonesia, in almost like in the year 2002, I exactly don't remember, I think 2005 or 2006, under the ILO technical assistance program, came to a conclusion that 3,000 would be the caloric requirement for anyone who is wanting to get living wage. Now ILO can take off from this example and give a recommendation that no minimum wage can be less than this caloric content. It is shocking. Bangladesh has 1,500 calories content. A man cannot survive in that. So you will have fainting. And we know from historical example that wherever there has been a loss of malnutrition, if I was told my other colleague from Malaysia here, that it happened in Malaysia 10, 15 years ago. So it's a recurring that happens whenever there's I mean, you have rightly said, so I won't get into that issue at all. Now, that's one point of view. Second point of view is that there is a regulation in the ILO. Unfortunately, as I said, that the ILO was conceived before the globalization, and so it was still framed in a nation-state framework. But there was one effort that was done in 1970s, which did not lead to a recommendation or a convention, but did go to a voluntary convention, a tripartite declaration for regulation of multinationals, or what is called a social. Now that's a voluntary agreement. That is not, you can't enforce it. Now, all that we are talking, what we are talking about a regional can all be framed within the framework of that tripartite declaration. But the tripartite declaration is a voluntary declaration. If ILO were to move this, unfortunately the union movement globally hasn't come back to this question yet. It is going to go as we go along. But the ILO can really start defining such a market or such a mechanism through a regional mechanism under the tripartite declaration. But the tripartite declaration has to go beyond becoming a voluntary to some kind of a convention, and the ILO getting a mandate to do that. Now that's a program that surely ILO can begin to do that, and I would urge that the tribunal gives that as a recommendation to do. So that's so I've taken the two questions that I had that was asked by me.
If my colleague will, you have a question? Okay.
Okay, let me speak in English for this question. so that it is here, because often my question will not fully translated. I don't get answer. Let me try to ask in English if I can get the answer. My question would be related to the standard. We focus a lot on the calorie setting, but of course, if there is any other non-food standard that has been set, because we are talking both, so we have, maybe we can argue endlessly about what would be the appropriate food calorie standard, but we haven't talked about the other two. And what I would like to view or to say here is that we tend to take the government setting in Indonesia is the more like official and should be followed. For me, I have the question of a serious setting and a political setting, because normally the government in Asia, they set it for political reason and it's not a committed to provide and to guarantee to their every individual citizen. So what is it? Why Indonesians set 3,000 calories instead of lower, where the FAO who try very hard to provide food, to eliminate malnutrition and all of that, they don't even move forward. So this is something to ask. And as I also said, if now Indonesians set 3,000, what can we anticipate next year? Maybe Cambodia want to get popularity, set 3,500 calories, and then the other would set 4,000 calories. What's going to happen? How can we have reliable that can be used for at least a period of time, 5 years, 10 years, before it can be reviewed? This is the question.
Make another question, and then I stop if nobody else. Because of the general implication of the relationship between the working class or the workers and, as you said, from the bottom, how you place your request in the context of what is the development, which is a very slow one but is interesting, of the Ruggie report on multinationals and the responsibility, because what we have heard here is something which seems to insist more and possibly accept, I don't know, but the fact that the multinationals are in fact allowed to self-regulate themselves, the fact of having audit from outside, and especially for the worker side, is not so well developed, though there is a lot of debate. Could you frame if in your experience and in your strategies you are including how the position of the multinational, of the garment industry in this confrontation with those who are working around or against the Ruggie report and its evolution? Because I think what you say, the normative need we have to regulate these things is obviously something which will innovate a lot with respect to the accountability of the multinationals with respect to the international law, while in fact so far multinationals claim themselves immune or outside the international law regulations.
Let me do the first question. I would suggest that among the various criteria for deciding living wage, the most widest consensus is on the food. So it's not that the other issues are not, there is no verifiable, or one cannot give numbers to it, but many other things. Like, let's take an example of what is a cultural aspiration. Cultural aspirations can be socially defined, nationally defined. There are lots of variation that is possible. The question of housing needs. The housing needs are different people have different families. The structure of the families are different. The requirements of housing is different. The culture of a house. So there are various countries have gone through various definition of how much is the need of housing. So what I'm saying is the non-food items, which are many other items that one requires for life, are something that are less universal. But there's one, on the food, there's a universality that has already come into existence. And the universality that has come into existence is that everyone is a physical body. And the physical body has what you would scientifically call a minimum physical requirement. Irrespective of whether he is an Indian, Chinese, Cambodia, Vietnamese, or American or Dutch, every physical body has a certain requirement. At least it can be correlated with, and I'm sure there are two doctors on the panel, and they can tell very clearly that there is a very well-defined threshold of what could be called humanness in the idea of a physicalness of a human being. So food is a very, very important criteria. So I would say among all the criteria in the living wage concept, the food criteria is the most universalized and most accepted, and that is why we made our innovation in the Asia floor wage is that we have gone to one core idea that is most universal, and that is the food component. And we have said any food basket by any culture, any country, so long it provides 300 calories, is something that an individual can survive in a human way. That's the first thing. Second thing is that what we have done is not look at the specificity of the food or other components, but looked at in what is called what is being well defined in economics as a developmental paradigm. That is what is called an Engel's law, that as a country moves more and more becomes developed, the contribution of a consumption to the food goes lower and lower. So we looked at all the global data and looked at the cutoff point, what could be called a middle developing country, which is what a good living wage should be all about. So we are not talking about the very high living wage. And let me also submit, except for Cambodia, because Cambodia, the garment is the only industry that has come to such an extent. In most of these countries, in China, in India, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, the wage that we are talking in AFW is a collective bargaining wage. This wage is not outside the collective bargaining band in those countries. It is somewhere in the middle of the collective bargaining wages. Other industries have achieved this, but because the garment, and this is another important point, that garment industry is everywhere in Asia is dominated by the women, is women workers. In fact, I would submit, I didn't have time to elaborate on this, that this undermining of the wage in the garment industry is a very fundamentally also discriminating against the women workers. That is why we have such a resistance in getting the garment workers' wages to be increased. So my submission again would be on this, that the non-food component can be just put as a ratio, and it serves the purpose of defining. So we have, in defining a shared floor wage, we have not taken any element that has come from our experience or our ideas. We have taken those elements which are most universally acknowledged and build on that. And to us, the physical minimum of a bodily requirement is the core concept on which we could have worked out, and that is why the food component has been the basis, and other ones are all factors. One could even think of a living wage which every one of them is done independently, and we have that can be, as I said, this is only one of the definition of living wage. But till something else comes in, this should be the one that should be operative. I mean, we'll be willing to have any other definition by anyone, including the brands. They can come with a definition of a living wage, and we can debate which is better. But until there's another definition of a living wage, which can be brought on a regional level, this is the only definition that has a universality and on which we can build on the arguments. So that's the first point. Second point is that when I said Indonesia, I was not supporting Indonesian government or Indonesia also does not give this. But the fact is that it is illegal. So when we wanted to come to 3,000 calories, we wanted to not just come with a notion. We wanted to get on a figure that is legally acceptable at least in one country in the world, or for at least one country in Asia. And Indonesia has already made that as one of the legal tools. So what I want to say, it is not only a notion, it's not only an idea, but it's also a legal entity in the Asian country. That is why it is important to generalize that from an Indonesian experience. This did not mean, or this does not mean that the Indonesian government or Indonesian unions or Indonesian people, all governments, all Asian governments tell something and don't do it. So it's a very common thing that we have so many laws that are not implemented. So that's the last point, and I think Ruggie framework was an important framework in the very idea of incorporating the human rights framework into, I would say, the companies did not want to regulate, did not want to regulate themselves. So they were not even accountable to the idea of human rights, and forget, let alone idea of labor rights. So the Ruggies framework is a crystallization in my submission and we would agree to that and we would go, but we want to go beyond it. It's a crystallization of the requirement of a human rights to be respected by any corporate body. So to that extent, it has accepted that framework. But it has accepted that framework in a self-regulatory framework. So we would suggest, and our experience, and this is where we would say our experience is much more larger than Ruggie, because we have lived through last 20 years of trying to implement code of conducts. CCC has been the pioneer in fighting for code of conducts. And they've lived through 15 to 20 years of seeing that the garment industry, the most globalized industry, ensure and respect labor rights and human rights. And the track record of the companies is so bad and so abysmal that we have no faith that the self-regulation can work. Maybe Ruggie can bring a self-regulation. Maybe he can change the moral world, but it'll take another 15, 20 years. There'll be much more faintings and much more dying in Cambodia, in Burma, and in India and Sri Lanka before the Ruggie's framework become implementable. So our point of view is we respect Ruggie's framework, we support it, but it is something that we cannot rely to change our life. Our life has to be changed by us, and we want to regulate that market ourselves, and we think the Asia Flow Ridge is one such tool.
Thanks for all those comments and the presentation. I think that we have come to a close of these sessions. I wonder whether my colleagues would like to have some comments on the general topics or not? No? Okay, I think that we shall have the opportunity of expressing ourselves collectively in the presentation of the results of our work the day after tomorrow. All of you know where it will take place at what time, and in any case they will be recording now. I must simply possibly not to conclude, because there is nothing concluded here. First, because as we have said at the beginning, these hearings is part of a process. Certainly we come some conclusions which will certainly be based as a principle on the testimonies of the workers, because they have been the central part of these hearings. As it has been said by my colleague here, we are listening here especially to those who are oppressed and who are deprived of their rights, and based on that we shall consider all the presentations which have been made by different experts with point of view which could be satisfactory or not. That will be our responsibility and our limitation or possibility to look for that. We do think that this process should go on, as it has been said, because the meaning of these courts is just to guarantee a continuity of attention, of research. We have had so many pilot experience which are proposed by multinationals. Workers do not have the time, not the possibility of having pilot experience. They have to fight and to resist continuously, and I do hope that our work and our results could contribute to this continuity across the borders, as it has been said, and at regional level. I have to thank you on behalf of my colleagues also for the participation and the presence, and thank you all and all the workers. They are not here now because they are working, but we thank specifically those persons who have been testifying on the behalf of their colleagues for what they are living every day and in very difficult conditions which are not so easy to change. Thanks a lot again, and to see you on the day after tomorrow. Thanks. Thanks to the interpreters, because I was absolutely astonished by the capacity, from my point of view, of following so well all the Cambodian language, and I think a very good effort, and I thank them for the patience, also because of the